what they say happens to you when you experience reincarnation is the elements of your DNA get disassembled and then they get reassembled into another form. Now, the form that they get reassembled. Okay, I definitely want to thank you for tuning into this video. If you're new to the channel, of course, consider subscribing. What I go over is esoteric and exoteric information in retrospect to how it influences you, of course, and how by being on a more pious lifestyle, how that can help you in your development and growth, okay? So in this particular video, I wanted to bring a couple of things to your attention. So, like for example, clearly I don't eat flesh. I don't consume flesh. The word meat actually translates to consumption. So, and I'll get into the reason why I don't consume flesh, but I want to kind of give you a visualization here. So like, let's just say if you had a piece of flesh that was sitting on the countertop, okay, and it was just sitting there, and then you left it there unattended, right? So after a few days or so, you'll notice that it'll start developing things. It'll start growing things from the fact that it's decaying, from the fact that it's actually going in a lesser condition. So then it starts developing things, and then some people might call that stuff, bad bacteria or viruses or contaminations or whatever. So then when you leave it there unattended, of course, then you'll notice that some of these things that starts developing starts walking around. And what it does, of course, is it is now depending upon the source that it was created from. So the flesh now is the parent to, let's just say, for example, the maggot, okay? So now the flesh is the parent to the maggot. So then the maggot now is needing to feed from the flesh in order to sustain its survival, its existence, okay? So then as it's feeding on the flesh, you notice the flesh starts diminishing, okay? It starts continually reducing in value. So when I assess all of this information in terms of the what are we even doing and why are we even doing it, what it actually looks like, of course, is that we have come in contact with unattended flesh, and we have things that have developed and grown from that unattended flesh, and then now those bad bacteria or viruses or infections or whatever word we want to use there to identify them, of course, I just used the word maggot earlier on. Now those are walking around and calling themselves people or calling themselves humans. And what they are doing, of course, is they are now seeking to feed off of the flesh that it was formed from. So like, for example, in so-called Greek mythology, one of the things that is mentioned, of course, is they say that the children are now leading over the parents. And even in the Bible, it refers to saying that children would be your leaders, okay? But in Greek mythology, it talks about how the parents were overthrown by the children. And then I was like, that's actually kind of interesting. So then when I do the research on it, of course, and then I start precepting this information with everything, because once you're up there, way up there, of course, there's a different view that you get when you look out as opposed to someone who opens the door down on the first floor. When they look out, they might not see much, if you get what I'm saying. But it's a different view you get when you can see further down the road. And that's what happens, of course, whenever you don't close yourself into information, where you're able to realize that what we're actually dealing with is fragmented information. So like, for example, what they say happens to you when you experience reincarnation is the elements of your DNA get disassembled, and then they get reassembled into another form. Now, the form that they get reassembled to is dependent upon how you were using your energies of life, of course, and your evolutionary message is depicted in your behavior. So that determines what form you get reassembled in. And then they say that when you get reassembled, of course, then you don't necessarily have your memory as to what you were before if you continually are on this path of not seeking after anything. That's the reason why in the book of Matthew it says, look, if the light that is in thee be darkness, then how great is that darkness? Because someone can go so far in darkness to where you can shine a light on them. And we say light is knowledge in this example. And they can be so far in darkness to where they can't see the light anymore. Have you ever experienced that, where you shine something, and if you keep going further and further away from it, of course, then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you can't see it. So we need to have the ability to, correlate that with reincarnation, or going through cycles of cyclicity, where you are being devalued. Because what we're actually dealing with is bodies within bodies within bodies within bodies. And then you can dwell in the bodies of the immortals, of course, and participate in those experiences, or you can be cast down into lower experiences, of course, and you have to work out those cycles of what's necessary in order for you to possibly be on a path of getting toward the places that maybe you came from. That's where you hear stories about these ones who have fallen, and now they have to do what is required to get back to the places that they are from, because it says those who are from above are always from above. So what I've noticed is that we've had the maggots, or we've had the bad infections, contaminations that have been really needing the ones who are from above to actually not realize that they're from above, so then they can continually feed off of them to sustain their existence, while they try from a genetic perspective to create and to splice and to do things to try to create a vessel for them to maybe exist in that might have the ability to ascend based on the codes of others. So what I've noticed is that this whole design of how this thing has been done is very, very, is very, very intelligent in terms of how it's happened. So obviously there's some resources that we've used. We've used microbiology, we've used quantum cosmology, we've used the Bible. We've also used, some so-called Greek mythology, of course. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of this Sumerian information in here real quick. So in those texts, it talks about how you had these ones who came from a different location, and then they came to another location, and then they were seeking after gold. Okay, so they were called the Anunnaki. So when you do the Parse syntax, is just really saying those from heaven to earth came, or those from a higher place to earth came, or then we're dealing with maybe personal names and things like that. So then we have these Anunnaki who came, and then they were mining for gold, and then it became very difficult for them, of course, because they weren't used to that type of labor. So then they said, okay, let us create a Lulu, or a primitive worker. So then they used resources from the place that they had landed to create this Lulu, or this primitive worker. And, there was a couple of trials and things that had went on, of course. But then when you fast forward, of course, the ones who were a part of that creation story gave portions of themselves to what they had created, which actually entitled them to the benefits of what they have. And they say that, you are who your father is, and then, whoever your father is, and that determines what your blessings are. And you get that referring to the so-called Israelites, when the blessings was being given according to their poles, or according to their families and so forth. So whoever your father is, that's who you are according to that information. So then a couple of the individuals from this group who came from other places got very upset, because they were receiving certain types of knowledge. And the knowledge that they was receiving was the structure of matter, genetics and reproduction. And then you had the signs and symbols of how this information was being taught according to their geographical location, of course, to where it was continually embedded into their cellular information, of course, and then they always had something that was available for them to rise from a lower position to a higher position. So then a couple of the individuals got very upset that this information was being taught. So then they devised plans and came up with systems to make sure that that information got reversed. So just think about that a little bit here. Don't forget, we have those who were formed from the unattended flesh, now seeking to survive by trying to contaminate what they were from, but not so much because they know that they can't exist without them being around, but they're being used in a way in order to try to gain access to something that they never was supposed to have access to, you know, period, exclamation point. So then you had three types of individuals, it seems. You have one, the ones who say, okay, these contaminations were generated from us. Let's just put them to work. What we want you to do is go out and subjugate everybody else, okay? And then this is what we'll do for you to have this kind of existence and so forth and so on if you are maintaining these things for us. That's group one. Then group two says, you know what, they come from us. Let's see if we can educate them. Let's see if we can raise them from lower positions of thought to some higher positions and so forth. And maybe we can graft them back into the family. Then you have another group, of course, who says, look at what they were formed from. I mean, it's a maggot. What do you expect the maggot to do eventually? So let's just kill them. You know, let's just get rid of them. Or they would just pack up and then they would just leave, and then, you know, they leave everybody else to work it out for themselves, to transcend from all of the systems and things that the maggots created, as well as the ones that have put them to work. And then you have to figure out how to get out of those systems, if you get what I'm saying. Some people like using the word consciousness there. Some people like using the word grids there, matrices there, and so forth and so on. So these are kind of like systems that have been designed to try to keep people confined to an area, if you get what I'm trying to explain. So then you have those who left their people in those conditions, and they're, who knows what they're doing. So I wanted to give you a couple of topics and a couple of different ways of looking at some information, and then I want you to run the assessment on yourself, okay? What you have to do is you have to say, okay, am I taking control of the direction of my own bliss juices? Am I that flesh that's unattended? Have I been that flesh that's unattended to where there have been things that have formed and have been created from being unattended, and now those things are seeking to survive by causing me to think that I need them as a source of my strength? Does that make sense? So you have to run that assessment. So once you run that assessment, then you say, you want to know what? I want to take the wheel and the direction and the control of the direction of my own DNA. Let's go ahead and do the cleanup process. So obviously there's 10 entry points to the body. You have the eyes, the ears, the nose, the skin, the mouth, the front private part, the back private area. And those areas are actually used for feces or eliminating waste. So then once you guard all of those gates, of course, then you can run the assessment internally to send things out of the waste areas that they're supposed to go. And then you can set things in motion in terms of what is qualified to be lifted to a higher position, or what has done what is necessary to be brought to a lower position. And don't forget that your evolutionary message is depicted in your behavior. So then you can take on the role as being someone who is actually casting someone down, or actually allowing for someone to rise. And that's how you have to be careful with your information that you are sharing, because you don't want to give the maggot more information that allows for it to be to where it's not it's susceptible to all kinds of agents and cleaning agents and so forth, what people call a superbug. So then a superbug would be something that has built up its defense mechanism so well to where whatever it is that you try to do toward it, it seems like it doesn't have an effect. So that's why it's important that you are careful with the information that you're saying. You also have to be careful because in certain communities, it's easy for you to say, I'm identifying the bad guy. It's them. This is what they were doing and this is how they've been doing it. But then if you are on this path of being lifted up in terms of your quality of thought, then you could actually be giving them the green light to do these things, if you get what I'm trying to explain. So you just have to be very careful with your words. That's why it's important that we quantify it a little bit better. So then once you're saying things like, look, flesh unattended, something could be grown from something that's unattended, and then that which was grown from something being unattended is now seeking to survive by suppressing what it was grown from, by making what it was grown from to not know who it is. And now you are seeking after that which was foreign from you for your source of strength, when in all actuality, there's no strength there. They're really just depleting your strength or seeking to deplete your strength while causing you to think that you need them. So it doesn't have the seed within it to reproduce itself, if you get what I'm saying. So we just want to be very, very careful. So I wanted to give you another way of looking at this information. And don't get too attached, because if you think of a superbug or if you think of a bacteria, a bad bacteria, what it does is it wants to try to develop keys of access. Some people say that you have a virus particle, and what it tries to do is attach itself to a cell, and then it has these protein keys, and it tries to figure out how to make a connection to where you start believing what it is, to the point to where you allow it to come in, and then it starts trying to command through you, or it starts trying to do things through that cell.
Contact. This is the moment when infection begins. How does infection happen? You see the tiny shapes there on the virus particle's surface? They seem like random blobs. In reality, they are tiny keys, proteins that have evolved to the perfect shape and size, enabling them to unlock these receptors on the surface of this lung cell. Like a smile and a handshake, the virus deceives this lung cell and is welcomed in, where it will command the cell to make more virus particles.
If you get what I'm saying. So it looks like if we approach it that way, as opposed to organizations, contaminating groups and things like that, because it seems like that will lead us in the wide path. So if we are looking at it from a narrow perspective, we say, okay, it says narrow is the way. So then let's quantify this stuff to the lowest common denominator. And we're really just talking about proteins and currents, energy, light, force, whatever all these types of things. So once you look at it like that, that's when it becomes very, very interesting, because it's hard to get emotional, or it's hard to try to say that someone is talking about your group or your organization and things like that. Does that kind of make sense? So we want to kind of get away from these contaminating associations, and we want to look at it more from the perspective of these geneticists, these so-called beings, because once you do the research, it talks about these ones who were very high up in their reality, and then they didn't necessarily need to come down to physical places of existence unless they wanted to. But in most situations, people are kind of interested in the lower senses of being able to have interactions with someone, sensual interactions. You get what I'm saying? So then you have to figure out, okay, well, how do you maintain these higher consciousness levels? And then we have to figure out a different word to use there instead of consciousness, but that might be a word you're familiar with. But then if you have these, let's just say you're aware of yourself in these higher realities, and then when you have an experience in a different reality that is more physical, then you have to maintain yourself in your higher realities, even though you might be having a physical experience, but you don't lose touch of yourself in your higher realities. That's you becoming a nation. And so the maggots and so forth, obviously, when you think of what an infection tries to do, it wants to try to take over a situation and shut it down. And then it wants to try to use your gifts, you know what I'm saying? And then it wants to take on your identity. So that's what we've had. We've had the infections now trying to take on the identity of who it was formed from. So that's the reason why the infections create movies and they cast themselves as the characters, because in all actuality, in their thinking, they think that they are who it is that they're portraying themselves to be, because they say, look, we're closely saying all the right words. They're not. They're calling themselves this, they're calling themselves that. Now, they're not going to admit and say they're the ones that promoted that ignorance, but they're just going to say, look at what we're identifying ourselves with. You see what I'm saying? Please accept us. You know, you get that in the book of Lamecca Cain, where it talks about these ones who were just not looked at. But then you will think about what have they done. What they've done is they've tried to attach themselves to everything that is real, even though they were just formed from unattended beings who are real. And then now they're trying to take on your identity, or they've been trying to take on the identity of what they was formed from, by saying that they are now not identifying themselves as what they should be identifying themselves with. And then now they're wanting to be looked at from a cosmic scale, if you want to use the word cosmic there, if you want to use the word. So whatever word you want to use there in terms of how large this situation is, which is very small, but in terms of how someone is trying to be viewed on a main stage. So I'm wanting these tips to be helpful for you, and to where it just kind of adds more to your interpretations, and it adds more to your viewpoint, to where you're like, okay, well, maybe it might be more helpful if we look at this information a little bit differently, and we try to disassociate ourselves with the gingerbread way of doing things, because when you are attached to those types of situations, of course, then it makes your actions predictable. And that's really what you're fighting to do, is to eliminate the superbugs, to eliminate the infections that are now trying to take on the identity of others, while seeking for some way for them to sustain their existence so they can get into places or go to places that they were never supposed to go to. And don't forget, in certain teachings, they talk about how they were never allowed into the temple or into certain areas of the temple. And then now that they got in, they just had a beer party. So they're similar to the rock star who crashed the hotel at the night of the party. Everybody was having fun, but now the next day comes, and then all the bills start showing up. So that's a perfect example of what these infections do, and what they've done, and how they've been trying to provide the cure for the sickness that they've caused. And all they do is provide more sickness. So we have to come to terms with that. And then when you say, you want to know what? we have to be set apart. Now you deal with the fact that, oh, well, you're not all inclusive, or you don't want to coexist, or you're not in harmony. What? Do you get what I'm saying? So it's like you're dealing with something that just, you know, so this is pretty much what we're saying here. And if you have any questions or comments about what I'm talking about in this particular video, you can definitely place them underneath the like button for me, and then we can have a dialogue. Let me know if this style of information is something that is helpful, because we want to get away from the labels, the organization labels, and we want to kind of bring this information to something that makes a little bit more sense. And what it really sounds like is we've had high beings who thought to create and seed areas, and then some of these areas were getting more physical and more physical and more physical and more physical, and then because of some of the things that they were creating started branching off and doing their own thing, then there was room for some contamination there, and then the contamination was trying to learn, and then the contamination got with other contaminations, and then was trying to figure out a way to trap some people from getting back to where they have the ability to get to, and try to keep them in lower experiences while they try to work out what's necessary for themselves. So it's really, really interesting. But you know, the way that it was done originally, it might have been good intentions. You get what I'm saying? But when we fast forward to right now, of course, we've have a proliferation of contaminations that have been seeking to survive without coming to terms that you know, that ascension is not for them, and you know, they're not interested in the cycles of reincarnation that are necessary to be grafted into an appropriate tree. So then they said, you know what, hey, let's just, you know, and then now we see what they've done, and how they've created templates for themselves to make themselves feel good about who they are. And now they're promulgating this on the main screen as if this is the poster child for success. But anyone who is aware, and there are a lot of us who are, knows that that's not it, you know. So so we just need to be able to come to terms with that information. Okay. All right. I'll see you in the next one.